Goedemorgen. Dumelang, Sanbonani, Moweni, Avusheni, Dimacheroni, Tawela, Bom dia, bonjour. Program Director is Philippa Tumugweni, and Vice Chancellor of the University of the Free State, Professor Jonathan Jansen, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. Democratic South Africa has bequeathed many, many wonderful things to the world. We've bequeathed a model of relatively peaceful and stable transition from an authoritarian system to democracy. We've bequeathed one of the most progressive constitutions, some of the most progressive laws and policies in the world. We've bequeathed iconic leadership figures, such as former President Nelson Mandela. Unfortunately, we've also bequeathed the abominable expression, all protocol observed. I hate this expression, and let me then rather say that I respect each and every one of you as a human being, as a citizen of South Africa, and that I will protocol you as I observe you. I'm very happy to have been invited to be here at the University of the Free State in the home of Brown Fisher, one of my heroes and a source of inspiration to me throughout my life, especially during difficult times. 25 years is often used as the measure for a generation. And therefore I can say that it was a generation ago, in the late 1980s, that I was also here at the University of the Free State. I wasn't in the company of the Vice Chancellor, definitely not as an invited guest. I don't think that the Vice Chancellor even knew that I was on campus unless the security branch had told him that I was around. The reason why I was here was that I was an activist in the student movement. I was studying at the University of Pretoria. We had tried to establish a branch of the National Union of South African Students, NUSAS. It was banned, and we reinvented ourselves as Studenten vir 'n Demokratiese Samelewing, SDS. And then we heard a very optimistic rumor that somewhere at the University of Free State there were about half a dozen souls who were against apartheid and wanted to create an organization. So we drove down in search of those half a dozen students. I think we found about 3. They were very scared. It was a very, very different campus to what it is now. I raise this for 2 reasons. The one is that I think it illustrates how far we've come, both as a nation, but I think for the University of the Free State as an institution. And I think it also gives me an opportunity to congratulate Professor Jansen for, I think, very, very excellent work that he's done during his tenure as Vice Chancellor. But I think it also gives us the opportunity to highlight and to reflect on the tremendous distance that both the University of the Free State as well as our country needs to go. It also gives me the opportunity to start touching upon what I was asked to talk about, and that is dialogue. And I would argue that one of the many dialogues that we need to have in South Africa, and I'll be spending most of my talk about the need for a dialogue on spatial justice in South Africa. But before then, I would argue that one of the most necessary dialogues that we need to have in South Africa is an intergenerational dialogue. It's important because our latest census, our National Development Plan, clearly indicates that South Africa, along with most of the other countries on our continent, has an overwhelmingly, one can also say predominantly youthful population. Something which is both a tremendous asset to our country, but if we don't address issues of education, of unemployment, that asset can be a source of great pain and instability to our nation. And I think we need to have a dialogue about that. To paraphrase Frans Fanon, who says that every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. And I think you as a generation, and particularly as a generation of architects, have a particular mission. We've had generations of leadership in our country, the generation of the 40s, the Nelson Mandelas, the Walter Sisulus, the Govan Mbekis, who, when the circumstances of our country called upon them, used their energy, their talent, their difficultly acquired education to organize people against oppression, and where necessary, to take up arms to do that, and so doing, risking their lives. I think through the efforts of that generation and successive generations of the 60s, the 76 generation, the generation of the 80s, it's possible for this generation to play a role that might, on the face of it, seem less traumatic, less perilous, but I would argue certainly none the less important. Because if the generations that have followed upon those that have laid the foundation for our democracy don't seize that baton and build upon that foundation, that struggle would have been in vain. But it would be a betrayal not only to those generations, but to yourselves and to future generations. So I think we need a dialogue both within this generation itself, as well as between this generation and previous generations, to do what Fanon said that every generation needs to do. At the dawn of our democracy, former Justice Albie Sachs wrote a very provocative and influential paper titled Spring is Rebellious, and it dealt with the future policy for arts. And Albie Sachs said that we all know where South Africa is, but we do not yet know what it is. Ours is the privileged generation that will make that discovery, if the apertures of our eyes are wide enough. The problem is whether we have sufficient cultural imagination to grasp the rich texture of the free and united South Africa that we've done so much to bring about. He went on to say that for decades now, we've possessed a political program for the future, the Freedom Charter, and more recently, the National Executive of the ANC has issued a set of constitutional guidelines which has laid down a basic constitutional approach to a united South Africa with a free and equal citizenry. What we have to ask ourselves now is whether we have an artistic and cultural vision that corresponds to this current phase in which a new South Africa, a nation, is emerging. Can we say that we have begun to grasp the full dimensions of the new country and new people that are struggling to give birth to itself? Or are we still trapped in the multiple ghettos of the apartheid imagination? And whilst that question was itself posed almost a generation ago, I think it's a question that in South Africa every generation would need to ask itself. And I think certainly it's a question that you as architects of the future would need to ask yourselves. But I think I've run a little bit ahead of myself. And I don't think I can launch into the topic of dialogue without remarking my discomfort at the disjuncture between form and content which the organizers have imposed on me. Because I think to discourse about dialogue in the form of a monologue does seem to be a little bit inappropriate. And unfortunately, seeing that as government we respect the autonomy of our universities, and I don't have the luxury and the latitude that Professor Janssen has to walk about you as students and ask you questions. You'll have to put up with my monologue, but I would be very happy to engage afterwards. But I think dialogue, in its most literal sense, for me, has to be a dialogue between people. Metaphorically, I think we can talk about a dialogue between ourselves and inanimate objects. We can talk about a dialogue between ourselves and abstract concepts. So I think we can and we must talk about a dialogue between ourselves and the space that we inhabit. But I think first and foremost, at a literal level, dialogue has to be dialogue between people. And I think therefore one needs to pose the question, what are the terms of the dialogue? I think, if I pronounce his name correctly, which I hope I will, Dun Janajir posed the question. He said, a dialogue needs an invitation to dialogue. I would argue that in South Africa we have a constitution that not only invites us to a dialogue, but in fact almost enjoins us as citizens to have a dialogue with each other. Because the preamble to that constitution starts off by saying that we, the people of South Africa, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this constitution as the supreme law of the Republic so as to, 1, heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice and fundamental human rights. Secondly, to lay the foundation for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. And thirdly, to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. And lastly, to build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. That preamble to our constitution, over and above being what I think to be a very poetic statement, I think contains within it some very fundamental concepts, which I think all of us as citizens need to engage with. Because certainly if one looks at that preamble and one studies it carefully, what's set out there is a vision for a society that must be very, very different from what we have at the moment. If we ask ourselves just a question, is our society the the kind of society that frees the potential of each person. I think we don't need to think very much to come to the conclusion that it's not. But I think the more penetrating and complex question is, what would a society, what would a South Africa look like that can say that it frees the potential of every person who lives in it? If we say that we are establishing a society based on social justice, how is it that that society would look? And I think that brings me back to the question that Albie Sachs posed, is that do you as a generation have the engagement? Do you have the cultural and artistic imagination to help us as a society imagine what we can and must be, to realize the vision that's contained in our Constitution? And I think for me that is a very powerful basis for a dialogue. For me it sets the framework for a national dialogue that we need to have. But I think also it points to the terms on which we as South Africans should be having that dialogue. Our Constitution, our coat of arms, has as its motto, and again I hope I do justice to the pronunciation of the Khoi and San language that's contained in that motto, which says, means diverse people unite. Now in the past, I don't know if some of you go back far enough to remember that we had another coat of arms before 2000. The motto of that coat of arms was Ex Unitate Vires, meaning out of unity comes strength. Out of unity comes strength certainly is a very powerful motto. But in the context which that motto was coined, it essentially says that strength will come not only from unity but from sameness. And that those who are not the same as those in power are different, and they are the other, and they are pushed out of the equation. We now have a constitution and a national motto which says diverse people unite. I think that speaks to one of the fundamental values of our Constitution, which is that we have the right both to be the same and to enjoy the same protection of our Constitution, but we also have the right to be different and to be respected as equal human beings, also because of our differences, not necessarily in spite of them. There's a very beautiful passage of the Quran which says, people, we have created you male and female and have made you nations and tribes so that you would recognize each other. That we've been created as different human beings, that we belong to different sexes, we look different, we have different shades of color of our skin, the texture of our hair is different, the shape of our noses is different, we talk different languages, we have different cultures. And I think we can never say that we must not see those things, or that we must ignore those things as a precondition to seeing each other as equals. The saying that race doesn't matter, or that I don't see color, I think for me is a profoundly troubling and in fact a reactionary one. Because what it in fact says is that if I can't see someone, if I can't see in someone else a mirror image of myself, I can't recognize their humanity and I can't accord them the human dignity that I expect myself to have. And I think therefore, when we talk about dialogue and engaging in dialogue, we also need to be clear about what it is that we're dialoguing, the framework, but also the condition upon which we enter that dialogue. I was listening the other day to Anton Goosen in die Commissie van Onderzoek. I don't know whether it's because there are so many commissions of inquiry going on at the moment. But Anton Goosen sings that and this was before 1994, he sings, Wie is die ons, en ons vir jou Suid-Afrika. And I think that is a dialogue that we must have. Who is that us, in we the people of South Africa? And I think that dialogue, the terms of that dialogue must also go beyond just the symbolic. They must go to the material conditions of our society. Because for as long as we, in our South African society, come from different socio-economic backgrounds, and those socio-economic backgrounds are racialized, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to conduct that dialogue as equals. I've been trying to deviate from my tendencies as a politician. I was joking to the organizers earlier that politicians generally don't care for speaking time limits. I'm already 2 minutes over my limit. So I'm going to try and compress. If I had more time, I would have engaged very extensively with the question of spatial justice. I was going to quote extensively from a very wonderful book by Edward Soja. It's titled Seeking Spatial Justice. And I was going to relate what Edward Soja says about spatial justice to where we find ourselves in South Africa. And the fact that, despite the fact that we are 20 years into democracy, if one looks around, one sees the legacy of apartheid everywhere in the space that we inhabit. The way that our towns are designed, the divide between the rural and the urban, the divide between the former Bantustans and the non-Bantustan areas. And I think we can recognize and we can justly celebrate as South Africans that we've made significant gains since 1994 in service delivery, in development, in housing, but we've not succeeded in reversing apartheid spatial patterns. For a variety of reasons, not the least because of the pressure to provide housing and services fast to people. Most of our infrastructure investments have actually served to reinforce the spatial status quo. So it's true, we can pat ourselves on the back that as a democratic South Africa in 20 years, we've provided 3.4 million people with houses. But if we look at where those houses have been built and what the implications of building those houses where they've been built are, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of transport, and in terms of the social cohesion of our nation. It's sad to say, but we have to admit that it's almost harder in 2013 to reverse apartheid geographies than it was in 1994. And that requires us to take very, very concerted action to do things differently from what we've been doing there. The reality is that South African cities have some of the lowest urban densities in the world, combined with a highly fragmented spatial form. Our cities are highly inefficient from resource consumption point of view because of the peripheral settlement sprawl, vehicle-based mobility, and gated residential developments for the middle classes versus township areas on the periphery, both of which require long commuting times. In terms of the National Development Plan, which was released last year, spatial transformation is key to building inclusive, sustainable and productive cities. The NDP provides an important framework for this. And flowing out of that National Development Plan, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, which I'm now in for about less than 2 months, after being in the Department of Justice for about 4 years, has developed an integrated urban development framework discussion document, which will be released in the next 2 weeks. In that document, we characterize this century as an urban century. Interestingly enough, as a country, we've also characterized it as an African century. And I think urbanization, the urban century and the African century, in fact, go hand in hand. Because Africa and Asia are probably the 2 fastest urbanizing continents or areas in the world. It's estimated that by 2030, Africa and Asia will have a predominantly urban population. By 2050, 60% of Africa and Asia's populations will be urban. That will be adding 2.6 billion people to the urban population of the world. I'm reading another book about, at the moment, called China's Urban Billion. China plans to urbanize 250 million people by 2030. That's 5 times our population. There's a whole lot of very complex issues about Chinese urbanization, but that's not for today's discussion. I think just to say that there are some things happening in China which we wouldn't necessarily want to repeat in South Africa. Second point that's made in the document, that once societies reach what is called an urban tipping point, it often coincides with a movement from lower income to middle income societies. However, in South Africa, the trend towards urbanization, instead of reaping what is termed an urban dividend, we are actually accumulating the negative effects of urbanization. And it's for that reason that we need an integrated urban development framework to deal with that reality and to put our urbanization path on a different trajectory. But I am now way over time, and I'm taxing the good nature and the friendship that I have with the program director. So I'm not going to abuse that anymore, except to say that hopefully within the next week or 2, we hope that integrated urban development framework discussion document will be made public. We would appreciate it immensely if you, as architectural professionals and as students of the architects of the future, can engage in a dialogue on that discussion document and feed into the process of developing an integrated urban development framework for South Africa. I think it's a very important dialogue to have. Much of our future depends on that. I thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for the overtime monologue. I wish you the best. Thank you very much.